Um, and kind of from the beginning, I wanted to sort of seed this with questions about kind of how art and science can support each other, how they can serve each other, how can they work together in a way that's not just kind of buzzwords colliding, especially thinking about um, this this moment in time where the Getty Center has launched this gigantic initiative of art and science collide with like 80 institutions in Southern California, all opening exhibits about art and science in some capacity. And what does that kind of mean to this group? What would you as a viewer hope to gain from exhibits that claim to be colliding art and science? Um, for me, I've always felt that art and science kind of come from the same place of extended observation, ideally of nature, but they kind of germinate into different products depending on the interests and the capabilities of the person or the people doing the observing. Um, so just wanting to kind of start off with thoughts like that. Um, and how can art engaged in the environment and in environmental science function outside of the space of fear and negativity and outside of this narrative of humans initially as destructors and then turned saviors? How can we respect the autonomy of nature in the way that we tell stories about nature? Um, and how do we communicate in this area from a playful and joyous space, which is the emotions that I hope to access when I enter nature and when I am spending time in this environment. This is a picture my friend Grace took last week. That's me hiding inside of a kelp forest. And I just burst out laughing when I saw this picture because it's just hilarious. It's just a bunch of, it's just legs in the kelp. And that's kind of how I feel sometimes in the kelp, that I'm just this kind of a small part of a larger environment, there to observe and there to kind of translate my observations into something that I can share. So a little bit of background. I studied biology and visual arts as an undergrad at Princeton. And I initially fell in love with photography as a way to create images of something that I had found in nature. And really the tangible physical craft of darkroom photography. So that physical chemical process of taking an image and turning it into a physical handmade print in the darkroom, watching that image appear in the developer, was what really got me hooked on photography as a tool. When I moved back to San Diego after undergrad, just over a decade ago, I ended up at Scripps because I was really obsessed with these marine collections. And the idea that in a marine collection, there's hundreds of thousands, even millions of stories waiting to be told. Each one of these jars has an entire story inside, the story of an individual, whether that's a fish, a worm, or a snail, and where that creature came from, and also the story of the person that collected it and that journey that it's made from wherever it originated into this jar that it is being held in. And then that story can continue into the future as it's used as an object to study. What can these creatures reveal to us as technology improves, as our sensing tools improve? What can we learn from these creatures? So I photographed hundreds of specimens in the Scripps collection, trying to find the good side of a snailfish, which is sometimes challenging. And really thinking of these as portraits of individuals. This project is kind of on pause, so I'm just going to barely touch on it as kind of a transition point for me. But since the pandemic, I haven't been able to get back into photographing these guys, but they're not going anywhere. So I hope that I can get back into the collection soon and keep that record going. But we're here to talk about kelp. So here's some kelp. I've always been a swimmer, but I started surfing and diving when I moved to San Diego in 2013 and 2014. And that was kind of the same time that I found myself at Scripps and in the collections. And then I started grad school in that time as well. Um, and I've been photographing in the kelp forest since that time. I started photographing with a 35 millimeter camera, then Iconos 3 in 2014, and then incorporating digital cameras in 2020. Um, and cameras and like I said, the tools of photography have been like a license or a ticket for me to kind of go exploring and get outside and observe nature using those tools. And taking those tools underwater really let me learn about the kelp forest and everything inside of there in a much more engaged, tangible way than what I was doing in the classroom and in the office. Um, and the more time I spent in the kelp forest, I think the more time anybody spends in the kelp forest, the more you realize how important it is to be thinking about the entire system versus a really single species approach, which is something that um, was starting to feel really like a big disconnect between the work that I was doing. I worked at NOAA Fisheries as a fisheries scientist for 8 years after I um, finished my grad school at Scripps. Um, and yeah, spending time in an environment like that, you can't sort things out and very simply put one thing in one jar and another thing in another jar. It's obvious that everything is very connected when you're in that space. And that brings us to abalone. This is one of the kind of long-term projects that I've been working on over the past several years. I've been compiling what I hope to turn into a book about the 7 species of abalone found on the Pacific West Coast, with the working title, The Iridescent Ones. There's over 60 species of abalone around the world, from here to the Mediterranean and even New Zealand. In California, we have 7. These are the shells of the 7 species that we have. The red is the largest of any abalone in the world. But also here in this image, then there's the pink, green, pinto, white, black, and flat abalone, and all of them have kind of their own niche within the kelp forest, but they're all grazers, so they all rely on having that that food material around and that habitat around. For those of you who aren't familiar, abalone are fantastically strange giant snails that hide out in the dark corners of the kelp. And all 7 species that we have in California are protected to some degree. And the white and the black abalone, the ones that are pictured on this slide, are listed as endangered, federally endangered. So there's a lot of conservation work happening around these species in particular. And I was able to photographically explore that for part of this project. Here are 2 pictures of white abalone. These 2 were born in the lab. So for white abalone, the conservation work that's happening is a captive breeding and outplanting program, which is a pretty remarkable feat of collaboration. There's over a dozen institutions in California working together to breed and raise these animals, because there's thousands of little teeny tiny white abalone born every year that are raised and then outplanted into the wild to support the wild populations. I've included the captions here. These 2 images are part of the exhibit that Emma mentioned, is up at the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium in San Pedro. And when I put this exhibit together, it was the first time I had made a photography exhibit specifically for an aquarium. It actually originally opened at the Aquarium of the Pacific and then moved to the Cabrillo Marine Science Center. And that was back in 2021 when I was writing these captions. And I was under a really strict word count limit. So I think I've left, I just copy pasted these over and they had the word counts in them still. So I left them because I thought it was sort of an interesting thing to think about. You have 60 words to communicate with somebody in an aquarium with an image. And that was, I think we actually ended up making these shorter. But 60 words was the limit I was given. And just existentially pairing these words with these images, I thought was a difficult task. Um, and as a primarily visual communicator at this point, I just want to leave the picture and not have any words there. But I'd love to hear either now or later if you guys feel that these are the messages you would want to receive with these images, or something different, something yeah. Um, these are the two images from the Black Abalone portion of that project. That abalone that you see being held is about the same age as the one in the previous picture. But this is a wild animal. The black abalone has not been bred in captivity. And the conservation work that's happening with them is focused on proactively collecting and relocating animals that are in high risk areas. The black abalone live in the intertidal zones, and so they're susceptible to being buried by landslides that are triggered by wildfires. And this is something that when I first learned about it, I had not put those pieces together as like wildfires potentially being a threat for abalone that are living in tide pools. But that's kind of how all of these pieces are interconnected in a way that is even bigger than I had initially thought of. Abalone can't run away, so this group of scientists from UC Santa Cruz, based at UC Santa Cruz, are actually going out and collecting them and then relocating them to an area where they're not at risk of being buried. And so these are two photos from that. All this abalone conservation and observation work got me really thinking about what the point of this all this very specific, species specific conservation work. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of people, it's a lot of funding that is really all hinging on the hope that their habitat is going to remain intact. And that is obviously a big unknown. If their habitat isn't stable, if the kelp forests aren't around, it doesn't ultimately really matter how many we can breed, how many we can outplant. And I know this is a defeatist line of thinking, but it's things like this that are often kind of the elephant in the room, I think, in academic marine conservation. Things that just don't get talked about because there aren't really straight answers for it. And maybe this space, this kind of art science colliding intersection is somewhere that we can ask questions like this, and we can at least get people thinking about things like this on a larger scale. For me, visiting the kelp forest, and this is the best case scenario, it's a feeling of joy. That's my foot, and that's a seal that needed to know what my fin was about. These things don't happen in your daily life on land. You don't get to encounter wild animals. You don't get to interact with them on their terms. So the feeling I'm generally interested in communicating these days is one of awe, one of wonder, one of the feeling of being small, of being a visitor to a space, to a witness to a space, to something so much bigger and stronger and more powerful than I am. And I started thinking about ways that I could kind of take action back with my hands, to do something physical that would make me feel like I was actually doing something. There's something about using your hands and tangibly making something, um, that is satisfying in a way that, for me, that doing something digitally, writing a report, printing something out is not. Um, and so when I started making these types of images, this is a cyanotype, of giant kelp. I started playing around with this printing process in 2018. Um, and it's kind of a direction that I've focused on since then, um, because of this tactility, that it's a tangible process and it results in a one of a kind handmade object that's had physical contact with nature, with the specimen. Um, it's a recording of the shadow of that piece of seaweed. And sometimes the seaweed, like in this image, actually leaves its own pigment behind, leaving a piece of itself on the paper. And this isn't a new thing. These are cyanotypes that were made by Anna Atkins in 1843, and they are species of seaweed that she collected in Britain, and pressed and then printed. And there's it was one of the first ways invented to record nature using the chemistry of photography, mixing art and science at that time. I'm happy to answer questions about the cyanotype process later. I don't need to get into the weeds about how it all functions, but it's two iron salts combined, that become sensitive to sunlight. So it's a chemical printing process, that you expose in the sun and wash in water, and you're recording shadows of images or shadows of whatever you place on the sensitized paper. And the first book of photographs in the world, is actually her cyanotypes of seaweed. So it's really nothing new that I've been doing recently. What I have really loved about this, beyond the tactility of it, is that it's able to capture both the scale and the detail of the giant kelp. And I think that's part of what helps it effectively communicate to people that feeling of being there, the feeling of being inside of the forest. So these are 5 portraits that I made on paper of individual stalks of giant kelp. These range between 12.5 and 16.5 feet long. And they were combined, they make up this forest, that I had the opportunity to put together for the Birch Aquarium. This show was called Hold Fast, and it consisted of 27 panels, life-size prints of giant kelp made with this cyanotype process that people could then get inside of and hopefully have this type of experience, but in an aquarium and not actually having to wear that wetsuit and that weight belt. So with this kind of ongoing project, under the title Blue Forest, I've been exploring different photographic printing processes to flesh out the diversity in the kelp forest, always using the similar parameters of collecting materials in the ocean on my dives, and then letting the specimen create its own shadow, letting it create its own image, and therefore its own picture. Also made some portraits of lab-grown kelp. These are all about 6-month-old giant kelp individuals that were grown by Mohammed Sederat in the Smith lab at Scripps. The 2 blue are a cyanotype, and the one in the center is a different process called lumen, but a similar photographic process as the cyanotypes. And yeah, this is a part of the process of making that Hold Fast show. This is in the foreground is the exhibits director at Birch wearing one of the first samples that I made, and that's me in the back, making one of the big prints. So yeah, that's my spiel. I'd love to open this up for questions, for discussion. I can bring back those questions I asked at the beginning, to remind folks of what um, I'm hoping to get just feelings and feedback on. Um, but yeah, maybe if I stop sharing, we can have a chat.
Awesome. I think I'll keep recording since we've got some time.
Yeah,
Discussion is an interesting part. A little different than Q&A. But
yeah.
presentation and yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I could get started with some of those unless somebody has anything pressing that they want to start with before that. Um, yeah, really exciting work. I remember that photo of the abalone on the finger, and I could resonate with a lot about what you were saying between I also do art and science, and it's this balance between being didactic and giving information and wanting to educate, but also wanting people to interpret things for their own. And it's a very fine line. But something
Yeah,
that I was thinking about immediately and that I've been thinking a lot about these days is so you have a background, you have an MAS in marine biodiversity, and then you also have a degree in art. And so you've been formally trained in both. And there were a few different books I've been reading in the past couple months where it pointed out that the word scientist or science was actually a phrase coined by William Whewell in 1834. And so before that, it was actually the philosophy of nature. And when I think about that way of describing our understanding and interpretation of the natural world, I think that philosophy of nature could apply either to art or to science very, very easily as
absolutely.
a binding medium. And so I wanted to kind of throw that back out to you is like, I guess in the world that we live in, when we think of that binary of like, this is art and this is science, and here they come together, but like, what would it be if they were neither one nor the other?
Yeah, I hadn't realized that term had come around at that time. I think that time period is super interesting. I think that's when a lot of things became segregated from each other. And it's also kind of the time when a lot of these processes that I've been using were developed. Photography was born right in that decade. And the collaborator that I worked with on the Holdfast show works with a process called Gyotaku, which was invented in Japan in 1838, I believe. So right around the same time, people are finding ways to record nature in new ways. And maybe that is kind of part of the the need that they felt at that time to separate themselves from other disciplines, or even to define the disciplines. Yeah, that's really interesting. Personally, I've always felt that they shouldn't be separated. It's all one line of inquiry. Like both artists and scientists get obsessed with really niche things and go on really deep dives and produce, one thing or the other. But yeah, I've always felt that they're totally intertwined.
Yeah, totally. I think that the division that really stands out for me is that point that you made with the abalone photos, where it's like working with the aquarium and having this like 50 word limit. I feel that science sometimes puts itself in this like category of like to inform and to educate, and then art puts it in this category of like interpretation and visual cues. So they're like two very different styles of communicating. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk more about that dichotomy.
Yeah, it's been a tough line to walk, because the even selecting the images to put in a 12 image show in an aquarium was a really difficult place for me to be, because the pictures I wanted to show were not the pictures that I felt fit with those captions. And those captions were sort of what I felt was expected, in terms of the information that needed to be communicated, or the information that they wanted to be communicated. And then taking that information and making it something that anybody from a 8-year-old kid to the grandparent that has brought them to the aquarium could take in, kind of added another layer of translation and consideration into what actually ended up on the wall. So yeah, it's a really tough line to walk. I always want to show the images that are like really esoteric and kind of abstract, or just like more open-ended, I guess. And I think the expectation for especially underwater photography is very like wildlife photography oriented, where we're showing you a thing, and not necessarily communicating an experience.
Mhm. Totally. That's a hard one to really answer. That's like almost like asking if like the representation of something can take the place of something. I don't know. I struggle with that as well. I'm like, you get, but I think it's also, I mean, it's worth a lot. The representation of something is worth a lot. Our visual cues in society, so much of it is representation and iconography and semiotics. And art plays a really big role in that, in the way that we think of the world and understand the world. And maybe people wouldn't have access to the kelp forests if it weren't for that representation. So it's exciting to see that in your work, and to see these really large kelp forest installations that make people feel they have a place in this ecosystem, even if it's not underwater. The other thing that I was thinking a lot about when you were talking about that problem of like missing the forest for the trees in essence. So like looking at that one
Yeah.
species, wanting to conserve that one species and not taking into account like its role in the other ecosystems around. So like for the black abalone, the mudslides that come in after the wildfires, or what does it mean when the abalone are not in the kelp forest? And is it like looking at all the inhabitants of a home? If all those inhabitants left, would anybody be there to take care of the home? And so
Yeah.
I think one of the things I struggle with is always like, as a human being, like what is the course of intervention? Because so much of the intervention needs to happen from the mediation of those sea creatures, and a lot of them are not there, maybe by influence of us, probably influence of
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. So what is that kind of like middle ground of like looking at all of the species and appreciating them for their individuality and their role in the ecosystem, but also paying attention to the entire forest? What do you think is like what's needed for us to get to that point?
That's a really fantastic question. I
It's a
don't
bit,
I
sorry.
don't know that I have a neat little answer for it. But I think it starts with more people spending more time observing, like in actually direct observation. I think a lot of um, I think there's a lot of people these days that can get an entire degree in marine science without getting the water. Um, and I think that's a huge I think that's a really huge part that needs to be part of an education. Um, if you're going to really understand how everything fits together. Um, but yeah, I think that's an ongoing thing that we need to keep thinking about. But it's a really good question.
Maybe somebody else wants to try to
Yeah.
to answer it if anybody has any thoughts on the question. So Oriana was saying she wanted to keep this kind of a discussion. So anybody that has thoughts can chime in and say what they're thinking, or comment about the presentation, or maybe something of their own work that might inspire the conversation to move forward. Anything and everything is welcome. Or if you just have like specific questions, you can drop it in the chat if you don't feel like saying it out loud. Or you can turn your cameras on and say it, however you guys want to go about it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from anybody. I know there's some familiar names in the grid down here.
Hey, Oriana, it's Morgan. We've met a couple times
Hi.
briefly. Thank you for
Yeah,
your
hi
talk. It
Morgan.
was really great. I find myself in the category of being a more kind of literal virtual designer. I do a lot of illustrations, and yeah, visual design that's more like kind of interpretive signage related and things like this, like more focusing
Hmm.
on like the hierarchy of how we present information, and how to kind of guide people through an experience. So it was just really lovely to hear your perspective, and kind of that more open-ended interpretive component of it, because I feel like that sometimes can get lost when trying to create this like exhibit type of experience or trying to present information in a way that like makes sense or you want people to be able to follow. It's like, what's the boundary, or how, where are you doing too much, you know? So it
Hmm.
was really cool to hear your perspective. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, thanks, Morgan. Yeah, that the pictures of the little abalone faces. It's like I wanted the caption to be like, "Did you know an abalone had a face? Like, look at its face. What is it like to have a face like this? Like your eyes can go in different directions, and your mouth is underneath your body, and what does that feel like?" But that's that's not what went on the wall, which is okay. But
Is it
yeah,
bad that like my mind went straight to like a little like speech bubble that's like, I'm not a rock.
yeah. No, I don't think that's bad at all. Yeah.
Don't just swim past me. I'm here.
Yeah, I actually have done speech bubbles in the tide pool sign that I did once. And it was more like, did you know a tide pool does this or something? Yeah, so there's definitely opportunities to do that. And I certainly try to bring an element of like playfulness and open-ended whimsy into the work that I do, because I don't want it to get like, I'm not a scientist, or I enjoy science and I really appreciate science, but I've never been someone who's comfortable with like, I guess, the traditional scientific method. Like, uh, when I studied science in school, it scared the heck out of me. Like, oh my God, I can't handle this. All a roll. So I think that's why I turned to art, and maybe you did too. But um, yeah, thank you.
I had a question. I don't know if you'll have any type of answer or experience with this, but I'm curious what you would think about, it's I guess a little bit about grants and funding. And I'm curious if you yourself or anyone that you know has gotten funding through like science granting agencies like NSF or something like that to do some of this work, because I think that like I've always thought underwater photography is so cool. I've wanted to like, get into it, but nice underwater cameras first.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm curious if you think it could be a possibility for somebody to like put, you know, that in a grant as like part of their outreach of like, oh, I'm gonna do this type of photography or this type of art, and like get money to be able to purchase that equipment and do some of that work.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think that's a part of the equation that a lot of people don't talk about a lot of the time. And yeah, grants are a huge part of this work. The abalone work was funded entirely by the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and that funding exists only because the white abalone is a species in the spotlight and it's federally endangered. And that's a whole nother like thing that drives me crazy to think about, is that like a species has to hit a certain, landmark of problem status to like become eligible for outreach funding. um, and I had found out that the white abalone was eligible for this funding, this pool of funding through the Sanctuary Foundation. I proposed this project to them, and they liked the idea of it, and that included funding for me to purchase the first digital underwater camera that I got, because you cannot photograph abalone underwater with a film camera with no lights. It's just a losing battle. Um, so that absolutely has been a big part of it, and is also something that has like gotten me questioning a lot about all of this. It's like, why are we focusing on like these most dire things? Like, yes, they're in a dire situation. Yes, we should focus on them, but they're in this dire situation because of the larger habitat issues. And if we're spending our outreach funding on talking about the tiniest part of this larger thing, like, yeah. So I've never worked with NSF grants, but I know lots of people have, but more on kind of the traditional like lab science side of things. I don't know if NSF has any like outreach type opportunities available, but yeah, absolutely. This is like the area that definitely some agencies are granting for, and I think more should. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
I
I
like
think that's a really cool idea to put it into the outreach part of an NSF grant. I think maybe that could work. I'm not an expert though.
Yeah, maybe this could be more inspiration to whoever scientists are in the room, like add an artist to the grant. Or
Yeah, I
collab.
think if you add them from the start, like from the proposal phase, it's super feasible to incorporate funding to like allow a collaboration to happen from the start.
Yeah, and I
Because
mean,
there's always an outreach section that is required, and the scientist never has the bandwidth to do it.
yeah, exactly. And they always want the budget info. So if that's part of the budget, then it's part of the budget. I'm
Yeah.
gonna read a question
Yeah, Frida had
from
a great
Frida.
question.
Yeah, so Frida says, you do both art and science, so I'm preaching to the choir, but what are your thoughts on having art come as a translator slash interpretation between science and the public as we go forward into the future? Do you feel like scientists are open to this type of idea or collaboration, or is this important, but it needs more time to establish trust and connection between those two areas?
Yeah, that's actually like a great, yeah, related to what we were just saying. I think it's really important. But I think it needs to like it can't be an afterthought. Or if it is an afterthought, it's not going to be as successful. And then it's going to fall more into like direct translation or interpretation. It's not going to be something that I think kind of rises above that. And I think if artists and scientists are working together from the beginning of a project, from the inception of a project, it can be a lot more than just a translation of, you know, taking what got published in a scientific journal and translating it into a 60-word caption. Like it can be a lot better than that. But even if that's all that happens, that's great because we've taken something that nobody can access and made it something that people can. But I think there's a lot of opportunity that isn't necessarily being taken advantage of, kind of connecting artists and scientists from the start of projects. And I think a really great example of this is a project that is part of the new show at the Birch Aquarium, Embodied Pacific, that's also part of this larger Getty Pacific Standard Time thing. And it's a collaboration that's been ongoing for years between Danielle McCaskill, who's a scientist at Scripps in the Smith Lab, and Joe Riley and Audrey Snyder, who are a pair of artists. And they've been working together on this idea of Undaria or wakame as an invasive species, or their project is called Passengers of Change, and kind of exploring the space of a species that is not native to this area, but what does this journey mean, and how does that manifest today in San Diego, where the species is now here. I don't know that I explained that terribly well, but it's a beautiful project, and Joe does a beautiful presentation on it. And I'd encourage you guys to check it out.
That sounds awesome. Can you please send me an email about that? I think I heard of
Yeah,
I gave a
it's
presentation.
all part of the same show that just opened at the Birch Aquarium. The Hold Fast show that was Dwight and I and Mohammed came down on Labor Day, and then just last week or the week before, Embodied Pacific opened, and it actually has it's 18 artists collaborating with scientists, and there's 10 different kind of projects, and Passengers of Change is one of them. And the kelp forest that I created is another one. It just kind of shrunk a little bit. Yeah.
Awesome.
So that's at the Birch Aquarium until I think middle of next year. Yeah.
Very cool.
I am curious about the cyanotyping process.
Hmm.
Surprised. I've always seen just the like pictures, photographs of the seaweed, but I'd never seen something like you have with the feet on there also. And so I think I'd always thought about it as like kind of a longer process where you would expose it to the sun for a long time, but now I'm not sure if it's instant or not. So yeah.
Yeah, it's not instant, so it is, I mean, it's a lot longer than like a photograph you take with a camera these days. But it depends on the sun, like the intensity of the sun that day and the time of day that you're doing it. But generally the exposures are between like 7 and 15 minutes long. So yeah, the one with the feet, I stood there for 15 minutes in the sun. Yeah. So it's like it's kind of long, but it's not like so long that you can't do that. Yeah.
Is it something that, like, if I wanted to try making a cyanotype, would that be like, could I just order the materials for it and do it myself? Okay,
Yes.
love to
Yes.
do that.
Yes. I kind of skipped through I had a last slide with a bunch of upcoming events, but if you're in the Southern California area, there's an event coming up with the Laguna Art Museum on November 9th. That's going to be a cyanotype workshop, but also like a community co-creation art thing, which I've actually never done before on this scale. But it's open to I mean, it's free, you just have to sign up. But we're gonna have 40 people all creating one giant artwork together. And it's gonna be cyanotype using natural materials. So it should be really fun. Yeah. But yeah, cyanotype it's super accessible. You can buy one of those kits. They're kind of terrible, but anybody can do it. Children can do it. It's just you put stuff on it, you put it in the sun, and you wash it. But it's like it's the fact that it's so accessible that makes it also so adaptable, and that it can like go in so many different directions. I think